Genesis 15 verse 1 to verse 21. God, who vouches for himself. God's revelation to humanity is not a one-time event, but a gradual process. It's like painting a portrait, first dots, then lines, then eyes and nose, until finally you can see whose face it is. By Genesis chapter 15, God's revelation has progressed significantly. Up until now, God has only promised that Abram's descendants would be as numerous as the sand on the seashore, and that his descendants would dwell in the land of Canaan. But in chapter 15, that time and situation become concrete. The Lord said to Abram, "Know for certain that your offspring will live as sojourners in another's land and serve its people, who will mistreat them for 400 years. And I will punish the nation they will serve, and afterwards they will leave it with great wealth. But you will return to your ancestors in peace and be buried. In the fourth generation they will return to this land, for the sin of the Amorites, who is the representative nation of Canaan, has not yet reached its fullness." Genesis 15 verse 13 to 16. Genesis 15 begins like this: After this, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision, saying, "Abram, do not be afraid, I am your shield and your great reward." Verse 1. Why did God reveal to himself, "I am your shield and your great reward"? Abram feared that the 4 kings he had defeated would retaliate against him, and he also felt some regret for refusing the gifts offered by the king of Sodom. Therefore, God said to him, "I am your shield and your great reward." Indeed, Abram was able to defeat the 4 kings and rescue Lot because God had delivered them into his hands. Even if they retaliated, God would be his shield. When God's servant overcomes worldly temptations, God will bestow upon him an immeasurable reward. At that time, Abram's greatest wish was to have a son. What use would God's many gifts be if he had no son? They would only allow the servants born into his household to inherit the property. The Lord said to him, "This man will not be your heir, but your own flesh and blood will." Then he took him outside and said, "Look up at the heavens and count the stars. Can you count them?" And he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Verses 4 and 5, Abram's response to this promise is the most remarkable statement in the entire Old and New Testaments. Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord credited it to him as righteousness. Verse 6, since the first humans sinned and were driven from God's sight, humanity's greatest challenge has been, how can a man be righteous before God? Job 9 verse 2. Only by becoming righteous can one enter into God's glory from a state of separation from Him and restore the severed relationship. But here it says, and the Lord credited it to him as righteousness. God said, "There is no one righteous, not even one," Romans 3 verse 10, and Abram was justified by the God who spoke these words. Brother, do you think the doctrine of justification by faith is only for believers in the New Testament era? Then, what do you think was the method of salvation in the Old Testament era? Whether in the New Testament era or the Old Testament era, the only way for sinners to come before God has always been through faith. This first and most fundamental word comes from Genesis 15 verse 6. And he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness. We should note that faith itself cannot constitute righteousness. If it did, faith would become merit and works, resulting in the claim of justification by works. Abram was justified because he believed that God promised to produce a Messiah from his offspring and that he was redeemed through the efficacy of his precious blood. Therefore, justification does not lie in faith itself, but in the content of faith, Christ. Galatians 3 verse 8 says, "Preach the gospel to Abraham." Although Abraham only saw a blurry image, as John 8 verse 56 says, "Your father Abraham rejoiced at my days, and when he saw them, he was glad." Abraham also became righteous because he believed in the gospel. "I know that my Redeemer lives, and in the end he will stand on the earth." Job 19 verse 25, when the time is right, this will happen someday in the future. Abraham will live a long life and return peacefully to his ancestors. Genesis 15 verse 15, God prophesies that his descendants will live as sojourners in Egypt for 400 years. In the fourth generation, they will return to the land. Genesis 15 verse 16, this prophecy succinctly illustrates the plan of salvation that God will unfold through Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Joshua. God repeatedly promises Abraham that he will give the birthplace of the Messiah to his descendants and establishes a covenant with Abraham. God instructed Abram to prepare a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old male ram, a turtle-dove, and a young pigeon. Genesis 15 verse 9, Abram took these and cut each in half, placing the halves opposite each other, except for the bird, which he did not cut. Genesis 15 verse 10, Abram did this because he knew what God intended to do. To solidify Abram's promise, God would hold a covenant ceremony. When the sun went down and darkness fell, behold, a smoking furnace and burning torches passed through the pieces of meat. Genesis 15 verse 17. In ancient Near East covenant ceremonies, the covenanting parties passed between pieces of split meat. This was a vow of absolute obedience, meaning that if one party broke the covenant, it would be as if the calf were split in two, Jeremiah 34 verse 18-20. Imagine the scene, as the sun set and darkness fell, behold, a smoking oven and a burning torch passed between the pieces of meat. The smoking oven and the burning torch signified the presence of God. God did this to tell Abram that he would keep his covenant with Abram. Here we should note that only Jehovah God himself passed through those pieces of meat. This was a unilateral agreement, called the Covenant of Grace. To fulfill this covenant, God guaranteed it with himself, I, the Lord, will do my plan in my own sovereignty. This was the covenant God made with Abram. The content of the covenant was always about offspring and land. According to God's promise, Abraham's physical descendants prospered and conquered the land of Canaan, thus fulfilling the covenant. But the essence of this covenant is that all people are saved through Jesus Christ and inherit an eternal heavenly inheritance. For this, God not only made a covenant but also pledged his own life, swearing an oath by his own name. Did God go to such lengths for humanity because he owed anything? Seeing God go to such lengths for sinners who have forsaken and rebelled against him, we can only feel awe, gratitude, and fear before God's immeasurable love. The faithful God, according to his promise, begot the Messiah from the descendants of Abraham, making his spiritual offspring as numerous as the stars in the sky. The Lord said, "For this is my blood of the covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins," Matthew 26 verse 28. Jesus Christ reaffirmed this covenant with his own life. Chapter 15 reveals to us that God is my shield and will greatly reward me. God is the shield and reward of those who believe in him. Brothers, let us kneel before the sovereignty of the faithful God, and live honestly before his covenant, which he himself guarantees. Questions of today. 1. What does, "I am your shield, and I will greatly reward you," mean? 2. How can a person become righteous before God? 3. Explain your understanding of God's covenant, which is secured by himself.